Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. You know, I'm kind of in a state of wow. With the World Series finally over, I can finally resume normal life. It's so good to be back in the studio after, like 2 to 3 weeks of participation with my son being on the Rangers, winning the World Series. This is like a big deal.
Charlie, how many people on the planet Earth can say their son casually was on the World Series winning baseball team? I mean, that is just such a rarity.
30 in 1 year can make that claim.
30 people out of 350 million people in America here. Yeah, exactly.
It's very
pretty
fun.
Special, pretty incredible. I've met your son. He's a really cool kid, too. I say that with all seriousness. Some of these guys get so blown up with themselves and everything. He just seems to really love what he does. And win or lose, he's there 100%. I saw him. Who was it? When the first game, somebody hit like a home run and won the game. Surprisingly.
Adolis Garcia.
They cut to the dugout and they showed your son screaming, waving the flag or whatever. He was a media attraction in the dugout. Yeah.
People said they saw more of Austin than they saw of other people.
I did. I saw him in the dugout screaming and yelling and going crazy.
So he's found a role. He's got a future. He's already has offers from other teams. And so, I mean, this is really early. World Series was over last week, and he's already got 2 teams talking to him about
People play
offers.
their whole career and never go to the World Series.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Most.
Yeah. So, and
we're fortunate.
You got to tag along and see it from the inside. Cool. We'll have to have him someday come in and talk about that experience.
Oh, yeah. We'll talk all about that. He'll do it.
Yeah.
He'll do it.
Okay. Well, today, not to, downplay what we're doing today, this is another interesting story you got.
Oh, this is very cool. Our guest today is so fun. In fact, my personal assistant, the amazing Melissa DeLacey, loves Nikki La Croce, and just, from hearing her podcast, from reading information about her. And I believe so will you as an audience love her after you hear what she has to say. Nikki, the fun thing, Nikki La Croce is yet another of those that we've interviewed a bit in the past, but another of those rule-breaking millennials. And as an ex-hippie, when you're talking about social rule breaking, you're right into my realm of thinking. And I just, it's important to know that I love Gen Zs and Millennials because they bring to us a refreshed sense of passion and purpose with values that are both traditional as well as at times shocking. And I love that. And so regarding a bit shocking, Nikki hosts a very popular podcast with the title of Who the Fuck? Soon, as she and I talked, possibly being rebranded as Who the Fuck Am I? Because that gives a little bit more definition. But just the name of her show offers a bit of that edgy style of creative and loving people in the Gen Z and Millennial camps. Her primary focus is all about human connection with a huge emphasis on the vehicle of conversation. So with that, I want to bring Nikki on the show. Nikki La Croce, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for that introduction. And I really loved the term rule-breaking millennial. It's in direct contrast with my people-pleasing nature that I am working through.
Oh, is that right? Really? You didn't tell me that you're a people-pleaser.
It's funny because I don't think that it's, some people I think are just inherently people pleasers. Everything they do for somebody else. That's not really the kind that I am. I've always been a bit defiant, but I will say that there's all the deep seated stuff that you work through as an adult, and you kind of look back on your life and you're like, well, I did that because I was worried what other people think. I'm kind of in that school of getting out of that mindset and thinking, okay, what is it that I want? Where do I want to go? And how can I best use that to help other people? So I think that rule breaking millennial is something that I will gladly wear as a badge of honor.
Ah, that's great. I think the people-pleasing thing, it begins with our parents, which is natural. I mean, that is natural. Yep. You want to please your parents because that is your only true, genuine connection in life until you're, I don't know what, 6, 8, 10, 12 years old. Your connection is with your parents. And then that rubs off into peers, accepting peers, because I'm sure, I don't know if I'm sure, but we could get into, I think the 3 common needs in our life is to be heard, to be cared for, and to be accepted by something we think is significant. And that acceptance it's just missing so much because we feel alienated, feel off to ourselves, feel people are judging us. And when we don't live in that state of mind, we create a Nikki La Croce doing what she thinks her soul and her universe is demanding of her. And I so appreciate that.
No, that's so complimentary. I appreciate it. And, you really hit on something that speaks a lot to why I'm doing this as well, which is that feeling of acceptance, not for my own feelings of acceptance, but for the desire to help other people feel more connected and understood and seen and heard, to your point, and just knowing how much people are suffering in that sense of loneliness now. So now more than ever, I feel like it's important to have these conversations. So I really appreciate you having me on to kind of dive into these parts of my world and your world that collide.
Now the conversation element in your approach is a newer approach, is it not? Like in the last 3 or 4 years that, you've focused very much more on connection and conversation. Is that true, that this is a more recent direction?
Yeah. So I began the podcast, almost 4 years ago now, or a little over 4 years ago now. And it really stemmed from a desire to create that connection. I've always been a talker. I, for the longest time, would joke around with people that I needed somebody to pay me to talk, because I feel like I worked in corporate America for a long enough time that, you're in rooms and it's like speak when spoken to, or be very conscious of what you're saying when you're saying things, whom you're saying it to. And in that regard, I struggle for a couple of reasons. One, I have ADHD, so sometimes the filter's just not there. And I'm like, I'm saying what I'm saying, and you're going to just, that's out in the world now, and we're all dealing with it. And then there's the other part of me that just genuinely feels this need to express things when I feel like people are very hung up on maybe the minutia or the insignificant details that don't really ultimately create something meaningful. And so a big part of why I did the podcast was to create space to challenge those things that, a lot of times in our day-to-day life, especially if we're in a very corporate or structured setting, we don't have the opportunity to explore those things. And the name of the show, as you pointed out, really came from this place of me going inward, thinking about, who am I? What do I want? Why am I like this? Do I even want to be like this? And the way that I was able to really grow, not just the show, but in my own right, it was recognizing that to have this type of conversation be as meaningful as I wanted it to be, I really needed to enter these conversations without judgment. I needed to come from a place of really as much objectivity as possible and be able to sit there with the stories that I was hearing. A lot of times people revealing and sharing parts of themselves that maybe they haven't ever even shared before, or things that are maybe a little heavy for some listeners. But what I realized was that the through line really was about how much resilience we have as human beings, and how that desire to find, peace and purpose is really such a driving factor, regardless of how many different ways our lives may feel like they're falling apart at times. The common thread really is that resilience of the human spirit. And that helped me find kind of that driving force behind the connection and the conversation.
I love resilience. I think we are much more resilient than we give credit for. And but it's so easy to get burdened with the difficulties and the traumas that we face in life, and yet even with those, people are so resilient. I totally concur. So I was thinking, where do we, although we began with nice chat, but where do we begin the deep conversation? You and I had such a grand pre-show conversation yesterday. You are what I call a divine conversationalist, and that's,
thank you.
Oh, it was fun. It was so fun. I mean, we talked for a lot longer than we thought we would. And that's what I wish to do again today. Don't worry, listeners, it's not going to be a lot longer. Although it may be, we cover a full hour. And as I thought about how we might start the meat of our conversation, tell me what you think, Nikki. I was thinking, what do you think about sort of a Cliff Notes, just kind of a highlighted version of what you wrote in your bio about you experienced in 2021, a personal Armageddon. That was a nice way to put it. There were a couple of events that genuinely changed the course of your life. Can you tell us about that, or is that safe to talk about? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you asking in that way, and definitely a big part of why I'm actually taking opportunities to be a guest on other shows is because I recognize the importance of sharing our stories. And the thing that I think really has challenged me is hearing other people be so vulnerable, recognizing that when I'm in the context of my own show, I can share kind of bits and pieces of my own life. But when I actually have the chance to provide a little bit more depthful context to why I am the way that I am and how my life has sort of played out thus far, it's really, it gives me a much stronger sense of connection to the people that I'm speaking to as well. Because I think when you hear things about people in sort of like pockets of information, you're also left to kind of deduce how all of those pieces come together. So I can start just kind of with that segue if you're good with it, or if there's a specific question.
Give us kind of a Cliff Notes of your Armageddon.
Sure. So I was living in Seattle at the time. So I grew up on the East Coast, but I moved out to Seattle in 2017 with my now ex-wife. And when I moved out there, I was working at Amazon for the corporate offices, and I was really carrying the weight of the relationship in a lot of ways, emotionally, financially, and just sort of day-to-day things that needed to happen.
Your relationship with your wife, not your relationship with Amazon.
Yes. Right. Thank you. Yep. And so I felt a sense of freedom that I was finally able to move away from my hometown. And I was thinking, this is a really good opportunity for me to just kind of explore what I want to do, knowing I didn't want to stay in a corporate space, but at least this was sort of an opportunity to capitalize on if I could. And over the course of my being there, my ex had gone through a lot she had told me over the years that she had dealt with sexual assault and different types of trauma. And she was sort of withholding with it, but then things became very, obviously disconnected from what I understood reality to be. In terms of that, like these random things would start to happen. I would feel like I was being gaslit, but I didn't really understand gaslighting. I didn't understand narcissistic abuse, let alone covert narcissistic abuse. And I also did not know what it looked like.
I've never heard covert narcissism, but it makes sense. It makes sense, just the thought.
Yeah, well, so the interesting thing because I learned a lot more about narcissism after the fact. But covert narcissism, we think of narcissists a lot as like they're these charming people and they just kind of convince you, that they're this version of who they are that they're not truly, and that's really more of their mask. Whereas a covert narcissist isn't, as the name would imply, not overt, but that they're much more subdued, and it's more kind of more strategic in a way where it's like you can kind of look at somebody who's, this is my interpretation of everything that I've learned, but it's sort of like they're the people that are, I can believe that they were a narcissist because they were super charming and they seemed this way, but then behind closed doors, they weren't that way at all. But like this person just sort of was like neutral all the time. And so they're so unassuming that it's like nobody's thinking that they're going to be like that because there's no like sort of duality that you see. It's just sort of their presence isn't really big enough to kind of recognize, that might be a red flag in some way. Mm-hmm. Kind of flying under the radar is the best way to describe it.
So that turned out to be a very damaging relationship to you emotionally, did it not?
Yeah, it was huge in that way. I ended up being put into situations that, unbeknownst to me at the time, were due to her really effectively leading a double life in pursuance of her substance abuse. And so in the course of a year, my cars were totaled like 3 times, and I finally ended up getting a dash cam because this kept happening. And the final time that she crashed my car was basically when, like, kind of within a couple of weeks of me deciding I needed to leave, to go back to stay with my family to just kind of figure out what I was going to do. But the reason that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, was because the dash cam footage showed her going to a homeless encampment, picking someone up and doing heroin in my car. So it was.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I'm an addict alcoholic, so I understand this behavior. You know, so it brings us, it's not humorous, but I'm laughing at the absurdity of it.
Yeah, well, I think that's and I appreciate you sharing that, Charlie, because I think the thing that really blew my mind was how, like, kind of willfully naive I was when there were all these other circumstances that were unfolding, because that was, I mean, there were plenty of things that were happening leading up to that should have been like, absolutely, this is not okay. This doesn't make sense, whatever. But when you're in a relationship with somebody who is just really kind of lying to you all the time, you're in a state of cognitive dissonance pretty much always. Right. And so to even get out of that, it's nearly impossible, even if rationally you understand that you should. But the moment for me that really, like, pushed me forward was when one of my best friends said to me, you know, you're asking for the bare minimum and you're not even getting that. Yeah. And I was like, oh, you know, there were a million things that people said to me over the years, a million thoughts that I had, many moments when I wanted to leave. I said I would leave and I didn't. And one of actually a friend I met through the podcast said to me, you left when you could. And that was a really healing thing for me to hear, because it's not easy to leave an abusive relationship, especially if you don't fully understand the extent of the abuse while you're in it.
Because you think it's your fault.
Well, and I think it's, at the time, it wasn't even that it was my fault as much, but I lacked the ability to prioritize myself for the sake of loyalty. And my mom and one of my good friends that actually had a conversation, I found this out, for my friend, was that they were worried that I would never leave because I was too loyal. And so I think I felt kind of an obligation because of the stories that my ex had told me. Now, granted, I don't know how many of them were true or not. I imagine to some effect, some of them were actually valid, but there were so many lies that it's, I think in retrospect, really hard to be like, oh, well, that clearly was the truth. That wasn't. And these are the parts that I can kind of piece together. But what I will say is, so when I made the decision to leave and go back and be with my family, it was still really mid-COVID, right before vaccines were even out. And I was just like, I have to go. I can't keep doing this. And so I went back east to stay with my sister, and she lived about 3 hours south of my parents. So I saw them a couple of times, but during that time that I was there, I was getting the clarity that I needed. And I made it clear that I didn't want to be with my ex anymore because of varieties of circumstances that happened as well. And when I was really just kind of in a place of, okay, I know that that's what I'm going to do, really, really unexpectedly, my mom passed away. And so it was the morning after hers and my dad's 39th wedding anniversary and my niece's third birthday. It was just such a shock.
And you were very close with your mother, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are people who will say that their mother's their best friend. I would never have said that.
Right.
But I think
that's, I won't comment. It's a little odd. But
yeah, I think for me, it's like my mom would be like, I'm not here to be your friend. That's how she would have said it. So, but especially as I became an adult, I think that we both recognize that a lot of the things that maybe challenged us with each other were things that we also were challenged by within ourselves. And that over the years when I was younger, if I ever had to say, am I closer with my mom or my dad? I love both my parents, but I would have absolutely said I'm closer to my mom. And I think my sister would have said she was closer to my dad. Mm-hmm. We have more similarities to them, and the way that we bond is more similar. Sure. And so
you had two very traumatic events.
Rapid fire. It was like, because the traumatic event of leaving my ex was sort of the culmination of probably a decade of traumatic events that I was just trying to get away from.
Yeah.
And in the 2 years prior to that actually happening, like 2019 through 2021 was chaotic to say the least. Like there were a lot of really bad situations happening. Like it was something that if COVID hadn't happened, to be honest with you, my parents even said this, that I probably would have gotten divorced sooner, but we were then, we were isolated together. And that is sort of the narcissist's dream, is to have you isolated from people and to just be able to kind of play the game that they're going to play. And so when I got away from it, and my mom had passed away, my original feeling was like, okay, I want my ex here, at the time still my spouse, so I could have some form of support. But she showed up. Was kind of a disaster, drove a wedge between my family and I. Yeah. It was bad. It was bad. So there was at that point, there was no turning back. I knew it. So I'd stayed with my family a little while longer. And then when I finally went back to Seattle, I saw some messages on her phone. And I think, as I mentioned to you yesterday, I'm not a snooper. I don't care to look at somebody's stuff. If I can trust somebody, I can trust somebody. But my address was being given to a number that was not saved in a phone. And I was like, what's going on here? And my ex chased me out of the house. She had been in the shower, so she chased me out of the house in a towel, tackled me to the ground, and nearly hit my head on a rock. I'm very glad that it was dark out. So I'm very glad that I knew where I was so I could kind of maneuver appropriately. But then she pinned me to the ground and quite savagely bit me twice to get the phone away from me.
Oh, and my goodness. This is crazy.
It's insane. And so when I tell this story, this is the thing, is I say it and I think to myself, Charlie, I'm like, it seems nuts. And I was actually sharing this story with somebody last night for the first time. And I'm like, please just know that this is not at all my life. And that is a big part of why, I think moments like that just further solidified, this is not your life. This is not you. This is not your problem. You need to get out of it. Right. And so for me, that was just, the obvious breaking point. But when she had done that, she actually ran upstairs with her phone, called somebody immediately and told them that I assaulted her. So that just gives you a little bit of context into, my mother has just passed away, and this is where that relationship is going. There was no coming back from it. I didn't have any desire to navigate that further. And then the reason I call my Armageddon is because of the intersection of those things happening, that departure being so aggressive and violent, and then losing my mom, but then dragging myself and my family through a really arduous divorce process because she just kept lying about things and I kept having to battle it instead of having the time to grieve my mom. And so it was a whirlwind, to say the least. But the good news is we're on the other side of that now. So it was,
and that's what I want to pursue, Nikki, is what does now, after having experienced that for a decade and very seriously for 2019 to 2021 or whatever, but you've made a radical change. You have a whole different philosophy of life than you had before. Tell me, how did you, because you are so strongly into connection and through conversation and dialogue as a means for connection, how in the world did you make that transition from this Armageddon to saying, we can't do this by ourselves. I need to do it with people that I can trust, that are intelligent, that are good people. How did you get to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Charlie. So I would say a big part of it is that I was very, very lucky that I had an extremely strong support system. And so a big reason why this matters so much to me in terms of opening the conversation, having these hard conversations, and not just hard, but vulnerable. It's difficult to go to those places. It's not for lack of wanting to, but it's emotional, right? And so when, I really recognized the benefit of doing the podcast while I was going through that, because when I was going through the hardest times before I made the choice to leave my ex, and I was still in Seattle before I saw my family, before losing my mom, I recognized that a big part of what was keeping me afloat was the connections that I was making through the podcast, because I had virtually no connection with my spouse. She actually would prefer it if I wasn't talking. And I'm like, why were we even together? That's literally the root of my existence is to talk. So, in retrospect, it should have been the biggest red flag. Just stop that at the very start.
So what made you see? What was there a circumstance, or was it just a realization? Did you kind of step into it gently, or was it sort of, hey, I've got to get other people involved in my life. Connection is what is critical, and we do that through relationship and conversation. How did you come up with connection and conversation?
So I actually was just saying this to my therapist this morning.
So is that your therapist? Am I your therapist questioner today?
Yeah, no, it's great. Because, I said, I remember sitting in your office and saying, I know that my purpose is to connect with people. I just don't know what that looks like yet. And so I'd started writing a blog entitled Who the Fuck Am I? And so that was actually the original name.
Which you and I have had a discussion about that.
But yeah, so when I came to that point, I was writing a little bit, and the thing that struck me with writing was that I'm very conscious of how I'm writing grammatically. My mom red penned everything I wrote growing up. So I feel too structured when I write. So for me to speak gave me more freedom to delve into things that didn't require maybe as much, not just structure, but so formulaic or
polished.
Yes,
it's not raw. And unless you learn to write raw, and then not everybody wants to hear raw. Not everybody loves Charles Bukowski poems.
Nice. Yes, totally. And I think to that point, Charlie, it was like I felt that there was something missing, because what I needed was for people in that moment, what I would have required was for people to, seek it out, find the blog, read it, and just sort of observe it. And I didn't want it to be purely observational for people. I wanted people to be part of that. I wanted to have conversations, because for me, the beauty in connection, and particularly through conversation, is that you are actively in those moments, even such as now, learning about people. And it's so dynamic. Whereas writing is, you're sort of waiting for the response, right? In a conversation, the response is pretty immediate. And that for me gave me more perspective on where I could go with those conversations as well. Because what I was learning was, when I first started, I felt too structured. It was like, okay, if I veer off track, then I'm so off track and I don't know how to get back to it organically. But if I'm not structured enough, then heaven knows where this conversation will go. And not that that's a bad thing, but does it make any sense to anybody listening? And so it was a lot of trial and error. I don't want to say a lot. There was some trial and error in the beginning for me to find the groove for like what feels the most natural to me, and gives guests the opportunity to share in a way that feels both safe and comfortable, but also gives them that chance, as you said. And I love that you use the word raw, because that's the word that I use a lot to describe the conversations, is that like raw vulnerability, and to go to that place that you might not have otherwise gone. When I have guests, I say to them, I'm like, this is not your show where you come to tell me your top 5 tips to whatever. If those top 5 tips come out, great. That's good. But I would much rather have a guest share the story that they've never shared before, or share the story that very rarely gets airtime, and delve into that, than be trying to, just pitch some content for somebody. And it's not that that doesn't matter. I care that people are able to promote the things that they're doing. But what I care more about is getting to know somebody. And in that same vein of the question that you asked, because when people can get to know you, then they can, trust you more. They can find similarities with you, or compassion for you if they don't have similarities. And so for me, it was really about building more connection to create more compassion that would hopefully allow people to build stronger relationships with people in their life, or see people in their lives with more gratitude or value.
That's great. You know what I want to do? We sort of covered the philosophy of the transition. Yesterday, we had conversations about specific ideas that, I have a note of like 5 things, and I don't know if we'll get to them, but 5 things I'd like to discuss. And I thought you had really, really insightful comments on connection, conversation, balance, intention, a number of different things. What I want to do is take a brief break, and then we're going to kind of do a shift, and we're going to go to tactics and things that you are doing, and kind of you and I are still going to stay philosophical. Don't worry, because I can't get away from it. But let's take a quick break, and we'll take a minor direction change in the second half.
Sounds great.
Hi there, this is Charlie Hedges, and you are listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie, and I have a very exciting guest today with Nikki La Croce, who is a podcast host, a woman who has experienced a successful life, had an Armageddon, sort of personal Armageddon experience that put her sort of down in the dumps, and she made a transition that is that's about connection and just the vitality of people needing to be vulnerable, people needing to be open and not just have to deal with thoughts about themselves or struggles all alone, that there are other compatriots that feel that. And so yesterday, Nikki and I had about an hour and 15 minute or hour and a half conversation that normally is like a 30-minute conversation when I interview guests, but we chatted so much, and there's a couple of things that Nikki said, that you said, Nikki, that I'd like to chat about. You said when you went to Seattle, and you're originally an East Coast woman, is that you got a job at Amazon, and it was what you expected, not what you expected, but you decided to hang in for I think you said 4 years that you worked with them. But there was something you said about working at Amazon that was really, I like this, Nikki. You said, working at Amazon didn't change my life so much as it changed my circumstances. And I think change of life or change of circumstance, I really want to explore that idea, because I think that's, we're thinking about these major changes in our lives, but our lives are made by circumstances. What circumstances do we deal with? What circumstances do we allow? How do we set up those circumstances? How do we, self-sabotage? How we set up good circumstances? Talk to me about the interchange and, difference, but, just the way they work together, that change of life and change of circumstance. I think that's brilliant, Nikki.
Yes. Well, thank you for reminding me that I said that too. Well, I will say, so I graduated at the peak of the recession in 2008. And so there was not a lot of opportunity. I graduated with a film degree. I wanted to be a documentary filmmaker at the time. And so when I fell, as I say, ass backwards into tech, I was very lucky with the timing of it. And so I think in regard to sort of circumstances is that I kept kind of following the path through the thing that I was equipped to do based on my experience. And what I ultimately came to the realization of when I was at Amazon was that it didn't really matter what company I was at or how much money I was making, or even potentially the location that I was, though I will say that relocating changed things for me significantly, because growing up on the East Coast, I really wanted to move to the West Coast. So that was something that I was really grateful for. It afforded me that opportunity to change my circumstance. So that I think is where it originally came from when I made that statement. But it kept my work life in a very similar place. The grind was actually a bit more because of the expectations of working for a company like Amazon. But what I recognized too was that I was finally out of student loan debt. I was able to do certain things.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm like, so Amazon paid for my student loans and my divorce, and for that I am grateful. But I think
I guess that's pretty big.
Right? It could have been a lot worse. So, I think the other thing that it did in terms of changing my circumstances is that the reason I started going to therapy was because I was miserable at my job. And you made the note that I had been there for 4 years, but after about a year, I was really questioning, like, what do I want to do with my life? This isn't fulfilling for me. This doesn't feel right to me. And the term that I've come to like quite a bit in the work that I'm doing personally and just looking and reading and therapy and all of that is doing things that are more in congruence with myself. And
right.
That school of thought really changed things for me, because it becomes less about what you are expected to do and more about what feels right for you to do.
What you are built to do, what your DNA to do, what's in your psyche, who you are, in alignment with that.
Yes, exactly. In alignment. Perfect. And so for me, it became so much about finding that place for myself. And what I didn't recognize really was how much I was sacrificing that, because so much of my motivation was, how do I gain the financial stability that I need? Mm-hmm. How do I keep myself afloat, both for my own reasons and because of being with somebody who just really didn't contribute and drained my finances quite a bit. And so when I got to this place where I was like, okay, the financial side is effectively covered, why am I doing this? You know, is there another reason that I'm doing this? I'm a good product manager, but to be honest with you, I'm not the best because I don't care enough, and it makes me.
You were so candid. That's great. Yeah, well, I really don't give a rat.
Well, as I was saying that, Charlie, it really made me think of the soccer coach that I had when I was in high school, and I was the second string goalkeeper. Our first string goalkeeper got hurt, and I ended up being the starting goalkeeper. And he said to me, he's like, "You're great because you're athletic. You'd be the best if you cared." And I'm like, yeah, but I don't, like my passion wasn't there. It was like, I like to do it and it's fine and I'm good enough at it, but it's not
a driver.
Yes. It's not the thing that's going to make me get out of bed in the morning. And so being at Amazon really opened my eyes to the fact that it's like, okay, you can make the money. You can make the money and you can do the job, and now what? And it's like, that's not solving the problem. That's not fulfilling the need or the purpose. And so because for me, technology is sort of the, it can kind of be a barrier to connection in a lot of ways, as much as it is a facilitator of connection. And so I tried to capitalize as much as possible on where I could make connections with people in my work life. And that wasn't just at Amazon, that was everywhere. And I always say when I left a job, the thing that I took with me the most was the relationships that I built while I was there. Everything else is just sort of irrelevant. And I think that was a really eye-opening thing for me too, is that it's never really about this type of work. It's fine. It's sustainable. It's good to have that skill set. But at the end of the day, I'm never going to think, oh, I'm bummed that I didn't take that opportunity in lieu of taking an opportunity that fuels my soul more. And so I was really on a quest to find a way to make those circumstances work in my favor towards fulfillment.
I love that. There's a chicken and egg situation going on with change of life or change of circumstances. You change your life, you change your circumstances. Changing your circumstances, change your life. But I think maybe it begins with I've got to make some change, whatever we call the change. But change in circumstance so impacts our emotional well-being. I was working recently at a place where I loved the place, I loved the mission, loved the vision, loved what I was doing, but there were circumstances that were very unhealthy for me. And when I was no longer in that, my life circumstances changed so radically that it allowed me, as I told you yesterday, I'm 74, allowed me to enter retirement without needing to be productive in a business sense. I love that. And it just allowed me to be alive and to catch things and to do it. I write, I do so many things that I love to do, but that is because the circumstances changed. As long as I was in this other environment, Nikki, it was, even if I wasn't thinking about it, it haunted me. It was a baggage that I was carrying. And how many of us carry a baggage from something that we think we have no escape, but we do. We always have. And I'm not saying you have to divorce. I'm not saying you have to do all of that. I'm just saying you're changing some of the situations so your circumstances are more, again, the word alignment, are more in line with who you are as a person. And when you can do that, you're living a much more fulfilled life.
Absolutely. And I like that you mentioned sort of that feeling of it haunting you even when you weren't really actively present with it, because that was always the signal for me that I was done with a job. Yep. Because first of all, it always just felt like a job. It felt like I was disposable. And this wasn't just at Amazon. This is my career in tech. And so I think when I entered the workforce and it felt like, well, you don't really have any value anyway because you don't have experience. I was very much operating under this mindset of I have to gain the experience so then that I'm important and I'm valuable and I'm, not replaceable, or at least not as easily replaceable, because we're all replaceable in that regard.
Of course.
But I think that, it was always this really kind of sharp pain that was unavoidable at some point. And so when I had left Amazon, I went to this other company very briefly. And the reason I went is because I met some really great people who were invested in it emotionally at the time in the way that I wanted it to be, but it just wasn't a very well-run company. It was very small. And the reason I say this is because I thought it was going to be this really great opportunity and it was going to free me from like that feeling. And in fact, it was just as bad, if not worse than Amazon, with the exception of people that I was creating relationships with. And the reason I ended up leaving that job was because I physically was getting sick with the anxiety of going to sleep every night, feeling stressed about it, waking up in the morning, feeling stressed about it.
That sucks.
And it's like, you shouldn't sacrifice your well-being for somebody else's dream.
Not over the long term. You may have to pay bills for a while, but I'm
glad you specified that. Yes, because I'm not naive enough to think. I've been broke, so I'm not naive enough to think sometimes you don't have to do it.
I've seen this movie before.
Yes.
Yeah. You know what I want to do? I'm realizing our time is getting nearer, but I have more questions, but there's 3 that I want to get to. You talked a lot to me about creating intention in your life. And it's not desired outcomes. It's not goals. There's something powerful about intention that goes deeper than accomplishing some financial or some kind of metric. There's something deeper to intention because it goes to our soul. Intention, I think, goes to our soul rather than to our outward successes or whatever. Tell me about your idea of intention, and then you talked about flow. Intention is flow. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I said was that intention used to feel sort of constraining to me. Because I thought, if I do something with intention, like I need just such maybe like a rigorous amount of structure to be able to be intentional about things. And so it felt a little restrictive for me in ways. I've recently done some coaching, and even prior to that, just sort of meditating and thinking on
as a
things.
Coach or as receiving coaching? Receiving
coaching.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I actively do not feel that coaching would be in alignment with who I am, but I really appreciate what people who are coaches do.
I get that. No, not from you, but I get the idea that it's a whole different structure. Yeah. So go ahead.
Well, and I think that's it, right? Is like I'm struggling to be accountable to myself. I don't need to have other people asking me to hold them accountable. It's just not going to work out for them. I'm not the qualified coach that you want.
Yeah, maybe in 5 or 10 years.
Right, exactly. Who knows where my world will go. But so when I think about intention, it's something that the concept's not new to me, but I think holding myself accountable to intention is something that I'm more deliberate about, more intentional about, oddly enough, because I recognize that, I want these results and I want to see what I can actually do to fulfill my potential. But if I'm not intentional about that, those things aren't going to just happen, right? So if I want to get, certain guests on my podcast, but I'm standing in this insecurity and this self-doubt, that I'm not even making the connections to try to reach out to them. So it's like, how can I have an expectation of what I want my life to be without being intentional about trying to design it that way? And so my perspective has shifted quite a bit in terms of why I feel intention is so important, because I see intention as sort of the guiding light to get us where we want to go. And intention can also be, I think, a good anchor, because the how we get somewhere or what we do to get there might not be what we expect. And I think you and I spoke about this a little bit yesterday. But if you understand why you're doing what you're doing, then the rest of the pieces can kind of fall together as they need to, or shift respectively over time and still get you to that. And if your intention changes, then it becomes more about, okay, well, why did my intention change? And is there something that is deeper, that I need to pay attention to. So I think intention helps ground us quite a bit.
You mentioned the word potential. Sort of the integration between potential and intention. We're going to get into spirituality. Is going to be our closing topic, believe it or not. But my listeners know that I am a great follower of the late medieval Christian mystics, and I, my Christianity is my mother tongue, but mysticism is where I am now, and mysticism is definitely true in the Christian environment, but it's true for the Sufis, for the Buddhists. Those are really critical. But Bonaventure talks about, and he wrote this in 1250. I mean, this guy's brilliant, Nikki. He's brilliant. And he wrote that, in our tradition, we believe in a creator and that we are created in the likeness of God and in the image of God. And that Bonaventure noted that we are created with potential. We don't have potential. We like to say, oh, you're living up to your potential. You're not. That's not what Bonaventure was talking about. Bonaventure doesn't talk about you live up to your potential. You are potential. You're created as potential. You're created for evolution. You're created for growth. You're created for transformation. And that potential, I think, is so powerful. And I love the distinction. You do not have potential. You are potential. And with your intention is the integration, intention, and moving forward in life to who you are created to be. Do you have thoughts on that? I know that's pretty theological.
Well, but I enjoy it. As we, mentioned when we were chatting before, I lean heavily into philosophical musings as well, which I think was a great way to dive into our connection. The idea of, I love the idea that you are potential, because the thing that
you are, I mean, it's brilliant, Nikki. It's brilliant. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's overwhelming right now, the thought. I love it.
Well, because I think it has a vastness to it, and a limitlessness to it that gives us a sense of possibility. Mm-hmm. And I think possibility is, and you may have said it and it might have cut out, so I apologize if I'm repeating what you just said, but I think possibility equates to hope. And that's what allows us to move forward, especially from really challenging situations in life. Because if we don't have hope, it's very hard to set an intention.
And we live in a hopeless world right now. And
it feels that way.
and we have to battle that.
Mm-hmm. We have to create hope, honestly. And so with that in mind, right, if we operate under the idea that we inherently are potential, then it does come back to us as human beings to create that world that we want to live in. And to create that world that we want to live in, we have to be intentional about it, and we have to be mindful of what it looks like to do that. And that is, to me, sort of that cycle that we're going through. And I think generationally it can be really challenging, because you mentioned, being a baby boomer, I'm an elder millennial. We both have a significant amount of respect for people who are in the Gen Z generation, just seeing how activated they are. And it's like, we all have to align around the same intention to be able to really bring cohesion and trust between the generations to deliver what results are best for humanity. And that intention, to me, is like the driving force behind all of that.
Yeah, I love the youth. You know what I want to do, because we cannot go finish this show without talking about your podcast. And I called you a rule-breaking millennial, which you loved, and which, I am a rule breaker. I just, my whole life, decades. But, what interested me was the title of your podcast, Who the Fuck? And then I like what you've added later. And, you and I have talked about, are you going to do anything with this? But the real question is, who the fuck am I? And, there's two things. You are a rule breaker in that you're challenging the thoughts of certainly of boomers and all that, don't want to use the word fuck. Although they all use it privately, they just don't want to use it publicly.
They're still taboo, I think, generationally.
Well, not when you're talking to them one-on-one. Well, I'll tell you, I know plenty of them. I know plenty of multimillionaires that it's their favorite word too. So, but they won't go public with it.
It's very diverse. It's very diverse.
They won't go public with it. So why did you see that risk as a marketing opportunity, or was something that was just very important for you to share, to get dialogue, to get feedback from an audience?
I love that you asked that question. I have never been asked that before. I think usually when I just say I was really asking myself that question. It truly was. The idea in terms of sort of shock value for marketing hadn't even occurred to me. And it also didn't occur to me that it could potentially alienate people.
Right.
I really just felt like this is the most genuine way to explain where I was coming from, because my internal dialogue was just repeatedly being like, who the fuck am I? What is this? And so the tagline for my show is inquisitive, authentic, unapologetic. And
I did not know that. I never read that. I love that. Authentic.
Yeah. So it was so interesting, Charlie, because it came to me. It was like, I had made this really crappy logo for myself. And then I did some crowdsourcing with a designer, and they came up with this question mark with the podcast microphone in it. And I just loved it. And so what I was trying to do as I was creating the brand was also make sure I had good brand guidelines and thinking about, okay, what is sort of my tagline or my message or my mission here? And so the idea of being inquisitive, that's the curiosity that you and I both talked about and shared. And the authenticity is that, just show up fully, be who you are. And whatever that looks like, that's okay. And there's space for this. And the unapologetic side of it, I think, probably relates most to the nature of the title, being who the fuck, because it's you know what? I'm not here to apologize to anybody for showing up the way that I am. And guests should not feel like they need to apologize for anything. Just be who you are, because I spent a lot of my life holding back, worried about what other people thought. And so interestingly enough, it had nothing to do with marketing. There was no shock value component there. It was really just, I think, me finally getting to a point and being like, this is who I am. This is the voice I'm going to use.
It's settled with you that this is defining my quest.
Yeah. And because I think, to get back to what you'd said earlier, there's something raw about it.
Yeah. It's genuine.
It grabs attention, sure. But it also, I think the amount of people that have reached out to me as guests have been like, oh my gosh, I've asked myself this question 100 times, So it feels like it unintentionally resonated a lot more, even just on the quest for guests than I anticipated. But I think as we were talking about sort of the nature of the show, I think it could be misleading for people who might think, oh, it's profane. It's rarely ever profane, with the exception of maybe a comment here or there. And profane meaning
it doesn't sound profane. It's not profane. It's just a legitimate. It's a legitimate question that all of us ask, and only rebel-rousing millennials and Gen Zs will actually ask it. That's brilliant.
I think the benefit too is that it really has lost its stigma a lot. So you've got books like The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck and things like that. It's become such a colloquialism, I think, too, in the way that we use it and how diversely we use it. So my hope is that, if somebody listens or even just thinks to research the show a little bit, that they'll understand that it's really not at all it's not an inappropriate show. In fact, it's very vulnerable. And I think in some ways, even putting that into the title, it's the vulnerability of I guess you're kind of going to take it or leave it. But I encourage people to give it a try, because, every episode's different. And the amount that I've just learned from guests is really inspiring and quite phenomenal. Okay.
I just talked to my producer. And, we kind of have mine is the last show of the day, so I can go later than most people. There's not another show coming into the studio. I do have a question that's a shift. And you said, because I'm very involved in mystical contemplation and action and seeking the divine and seeking intimacy with the divine. So spirituality is not like a big part of my life, Nikki. It is my life, apart from my wife and my son. This is my life. And you mentioned, so let's close with this. You mentioned you were creeping into spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
What is that, and how do you feel you will profit from that? Profit authentically, not financially, but
yes.
Profit in your soul.
So, that's such a, okay. So spirituality.
I love asking questions that people are not ready for.
Yes. Well, what I love about it is because I'm very rarely rendered speechless. It'll just take me a moment to think about the best way to respond. I love the way that you asked that. As we discussed, I was raised Catholic. I'm not a practicing Catholic. I don't really identify with the religion. And frankly, just, from my own experience and perspective, I don't really have a desire to participate in organized religion. But, when I was, right before I lost my mom, actually, and I was just struggling to sleep, to function. I was so stressed with the situations that I was describing earlier with my ex that I started listening a lot more to philosophical and spiritual content. So whether that was frequencies to just kind of help, dial down the voice in my brain that was talking to me about all of my anxiety.
Dialing down the energy or the volume.
Yeah, exactly. And just giving me space to sit, and have a sense of calm. I did more kind of like sleep hypnosis and meditation type things that I was leaning into. But one of the biggest things that shifted for me was really leaning into, learning a lot more about Zen Buddhism and Taoism and paying attention to the philosophy behind it. And the spiritual component sort of really came in after losing my mom more because I really wanted to feel connected to her despite her not being here in the physical sense. But as I mentioned to you when we first spoke, Alan Watts was really, really influential for me. I feel like I've always said that I'm an old soul, but listening to his theory and philosophy and just the way he educates people, it spoke to my soul and it really opened me up more to that sense of spirituality. And so I feel like that came at a time when I was really ready for it and open to it. And Pema Chodron as well, just listening to some dialogues there around Buddhism and the impermanence of things was really important for me, especially after losing my mom. But the thing that really elevated my spirituality to the next level was that my now wife, who is just such a beautiful soul in all ways, she's very connected spiritually, always has been. Her mom and her throughout their lives have been, they've gone to mediums and psychics and things like that, but also just sort of delved more into sort of the mysticism side of things. And my wife had actually, I think opened diluted my skepticism because I think I was very nervous to open up to it for fear of, just like
because it's so controlling and it's so restrictive and it's so talk about rule following. If you don't follow these rules, there's the innies and the outies, and how do you have innies and outies in spirituality when we're talking about relationship? We're talking about intimacy with the divine, and that's all we're looking for.
Yeah, it gave me the freedom to explore what spirituality meant to me because she's so non-judgmental. And it was it opened my entire world to the possibility of connecting. And I was able to share with her things that I've felt connected to spiritually that I thought maybe seemed crazy before. And, not that they're not even, I think, extravagant or by comparison, even, very significant, but these little inklings, I've always been very intuitive, had a really strong gut feeling about things. That's actually a lot of why I knew things were happening in my last relationship, because before a car accident would happen, I would get a gut feeling and I would know something was wrong. And then I would find out that something had happened. So I was just learning to trust that more. And then I was also in a safe space with somebody who invited me to explore that and would engage with me in conversations about what that meant or how I felt about it. And that really opened my eyes and my world to the value of spirituality. And so I have a regular practice of meditation now that I really value. And I'll tell you what, the other thing is with regard to that is really leaning into gratitude because, you know, I find that when I'm not meditating or I'm not actively expressing gratitude, very consciously or intentionally expressing gratitude, I notice that over the course of days of absence of those things, like my energy changes, my vibe changes, and I don't like it. So, I think I went from being like, that's woo woo to being like, okay, this is a really effective way and a connective way to allow myself space for the things that maybe aren't easy to explain, but we feel and we get to trust that within ourselves.
Well, you know, for the last 45 years, I had nothing to do with spirituality until I was 30 years old. So for the last 44 years, it's been, you know, a major aspect of my life. And I see, you know, that's my potential role with you in the future is to be your spiritual friend, not your spiritual director, but your spiritual friend who has been through a lot of paths and experienced in it and could give you feedback and we could discuss things. That could be our role in the future, Nikki La Croce.
I love that.
Nikki La Croce, you are my favorite words. You are too cool. I'm loving this time. Thank you so much for spending the time with me and for just the compassionate and intelligent conversation. You know, I don't always find that together with great ideas. You are a very bright woman. And as I told you yesterday, I'm a snob toward bright people. I love bright people. And you were there. You know, tell me something, Nikki. Is there any way, you know, I'm going to put your podcast on my links on the show. Is there any way that you want folks to find out more about you apart from the podcast?
Sure. Thank you for asking. And thank you so much for the compliment. And Charlie, the pleasure has just been all mine as well. It really was such a phenomenal conversation. You asked wonderful questions and I love being able to think to this depth. It's, my favorite thing to do is think about things. So it's nice to be able to talk about those things that I think about.
Yeah. We're kindred spirit, friend.
Yes, amen to that. So, in terms of where people can find me, the website is whothefck.com. And so you can find links to the show and everything there. And, I'll be getting
whothef.com, just F.
Whothefck.com.
Oh, yeah. Whothefck.com. Okay. And they can find out more about you on that.
Yep. The show, you can contact me there, and then also I'll be getting like a merch site and things like that up soon. So
now we're getting into capitalism. Okay. Gotta make bucks.
Hey, you know, the good thing is that my wife and I, she has over 12 years experience within e-commerce business, and so a big part of what we want to do is focus on give back as part of the brands that we're building. So capitalism at its finest, of course, you know, sometimes the system gets you, but we definitely want to make sure that we're giving back in the ways that we can.
There you go. Well, Nikki La Croce, thank you so much. And I look forward to an ongoing relationship. I want to thank all our listeners as well for tuning in to the next chapter. Until next, this is Charlie Hedges. Bye for now.